people across the schools are members of the Earth Institute, and we've come together with the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network to offer, and we were doing this actually before COVID. The idea is to offer an online master's, but to do it with the idea of blending a few things. Like one is the actual lectures in UCD, like Andrew Jackson, myself, etc., across the schools, but also working with the SDG Academy, which has scientists and policymaker and practitioners in their kind of digital, I call it library or resources. And then we can also use the network for placements right across the world. So it's kind of a partnership model in the classroom. And the joy is that, yeah, you're not on campus meeting individuals face to face, but daily you're getting experts from everywhere in the world, which you'd never be face to face with virtually or talking to at that sort of degree or extent. So there's people on the call who might consider doing this. A beautiful part-time option. So it's not that onerous. And then maybe when we come into the fall, you might start scrambling to send your students to do something. And these modules are open for any of our masters to actually send students. So myself and Jeff Sachs are teaching our core module on, let's call it 101 Sustainable Development, with a special focus on COVID-19. So that could be something to think about. Anyway, the project itself, the 3 people, so I just better acknowledge Enda Murphy, obviously from the School of Architecture, Planning and Environmental Policy, you know him, and our Preecha Bajare, who's in the business school, and who's in the business school now in UCD, and myself. So we came together and we basically, where this comes, I'll have to give the credit to Enda really, because we were all attending the High Level Political Forum in New York, which is the body or the entity that reviews anything that happens on the SDGs through the whole UN system and stakeholder system. And in a sense, I was involved in these things, but I guess Enda was the one clever enough to say, well, how do, you know, people could be saying, what are you doing as an academic in these sort of forums, like with ministers and leaders of countries, etc. You know, where's the academic work, where's the papers, and how do you finance going there? And of course he said, well, do you know what, there isn't really an academic literature on this sort of science policy interface, and that there actually is a good body of work to be done to say, well, how do we get science and knowledge into policy? And there are these forums at global levels, and even, you know, in the European Parliament, and now we're creating them at a national level. And that really this should become an area of research. So in a sense, when we applied for the EPA, had a call on the SDGs, we put in this sort of governance piece, and I'll give credit to Enda for pushing that. And so what you're seeing now is basically a kind of report on what we've done on this particular EPA project. So I have too many slides, and I'll try to keep it light because it's supposed to be just over coffee. But I'll try and just give you motivations. So in a sense, I want to talk about 3 things. One is the whole sort of SDG global reporting framework and science policy interface at a global level. And the reason why I want to focus on this is that, you know, when we're talking about climate policy or, you know, biodiversity, et cetera, like there's always this sort of idea that, well, what you do in Ireland maybe doesn't matter. We're too small. The sort of reduction in emissions is not really going to affect the overall picture in terms of climate change and biodiversity globally, et cetera, right? And that may be true, but the place where there is a common framework is the UN across China, Europe, and the United States, etc. And, you know, the idea here is that the idea of this project is that we want interoperability with global reporting. So we want to take our place at the seat at the UN, and when we do our work at home and we bring it to the UN, we want every nation to be cooperating. And it's a kind of a new kind of wave of multilateralism for what we call the 21st century. And we want to make sure that you can't have Ireland just doing its own thing, Europe doing its own thing, and then expect some sort of global response or a kind of unified global response to something like climate change. So that's why in looking at the indicators for Ireland and the governance structures for managing the environment, we wanted to be interoperable with the global reporting and the global governance frameworks, because then we can do it at home but have a big impact abroad, etc. So that reason we had to set out looking at the UN statistical, the UN, hold on, I just need to close the door here, 2 seconds. Sorry, I forgot to give out the shout. I'm on a call because I can just hear something going to kick off in the background, so I decided to close the door for usual family things. Okay, so the benchmarking, the SDG. So there is data. You could go and get environmental data and create environmental data, and there's lots of ways you could do various issues, but we just wanted to stick to what the UN Statistical Commission were doing, because cleverly enough, they didn't get into those sort of issues of monitoring during the negotiation. They said, look, issues of science and indicators and statistics, we'll give it to the UN Statistical Commission, but it has taken it 3 or 4 and now going into the 5th year to come up with the appropriate, what we call tier 1 indicators. And I'll take you through that in a second. But the point about this is that we wanted to collect the indicators, the UN statistical approved indicators for Ireland, so that Ireland could be in the reports and in the conversations. And we'll also show that actually by benchmarking to best and worst in class in the EU or even in the world, we can actually go into a conversation. Like there's a little bit of a clumsiness in the UN where the best in class is always Sweden, but they're not the best in class for everything. And I think there's 169 234 actually indicators for this SDG project, and it's very important that you highlight the best and worst in class, look at their policy, successful policies, and then have a fruitful conversation at something like the HLPF, etc. And then finally, after having the right sort of indicators so that we can see where we're doing badly or not are doing well, and try and rationalize why we're doing badly or well in that sort of policy context, I want to show you the sort of recommendations that we're pushing for science policy interface in Ireland, the environment, okay? So obviously we've had that great legal win with the climate action case, so it's not just moral anymore, there's a legal imperative to have a proper climate mitigation path. And we know we've had citizens' assemblies, we know we've had programs for governments, NOCTAN's committees, we know we have, I'll show you all the different climate councils, etc. But you know, we really have to have, and it's coming into place, a proper sort of institutional governance structure for whole of society approaches led by science and facilitated by government that actually leads to policy change, which is very much integrating the whole sort of economic, social, environmental policies. So in a sense, one of the understated pillars of sustainable development is governance. But we're going to argue that this sort of, it's a real necessary condition to have integrated policies, that your institutions are capable of this. And we kind of know this from the Earth Institute was important there with the new BSc in sustainability, and even our masters now in sustainable development and the PhD programs. Like, it can be very difficult when schools are in their own silos and disciplines are in those silos that you can actually come up with a true sort of interlinked program and curriculum on sustainable development. But this is the same in government departments and government policies, that they truly have to come together and they have to come up with integrated policies. So you don't just have economic growth where there's rising social inequality in lots of areas and environmental destruction. You have to do, obviously, economic prosperity that's inclusive and sustainable. But if you're not bringing the agencies and the government and the stakeholders together to come up with the right policies, if you don't have the institutions or the measurements or the indicators in place for these sort of linkages, you have no hope of having that conversation or ever coming up with good policies. So that's really the gist of our project, and I went on too long there. Okay, let me go further. Slides will go down for me. So this is just to remind folks that the SDGs, really the UN 2030 agenda has 4 elements. It has actually a vision or a narrative or kind of a theoretical framework in a way. It has the goals and targets, obviously. It also has a section on what we call means of implementation. This is like finance and data and technologies, etc., partnerships. And then it also has the follow-up and review process. This is what we're talking about today, the more monitoring and governance aspects around accountability of actually delivering the goals. The other thing I want to point out is that the UN, it's having problems with finance, obviously, and multilateralism in general is having problems. But coming into the goals and for the first few years, they certainly have opened up to what we call avenues for the science policy interface. So this is where academics and scientists and research can actually interface in important ways with developing UN policies and agendas, setting agendas, implementing and following up and review. So the ones that just to pay attention to is obviously the annual meeting of stakeholders, the high-level political forum, which is unfortunately virtual this year. The other one is for science, technology and innovation. They have what's called the SDI forum. It's like a subcommittee of HLPF, but there's interesting Connect UN. This is the idea of patents and good practice in technologies and sharing technologies across country. It's a very nice sort of platform for doing that. It's worth looking at, particularly if you're actually bringing your product to market and you might be working with Novo and UCD, but really just have a look at seeing what sort of partnerships you could get here on this platform. It's not too dissimilar to what's called the GoSpin and UK UNESCO, but GoSpin is more about the science, technology, innovation policies across countries, and they do kind of country reports and asking whether the science, technology, innovation is pro-sustainable development really, and not promoting kind of the wrong policies for the environment and for society, which might be the right policies for the economy. So I think there are interesting digital platforms to talk about science, technology, innovation and its orientation and which governments are doing it right or wrong. And then this one is more for companies and countries, but it's more countries facilitating the exchange of technologies for countries, across countries. The Global Sustainable Development Report is a key science. This one you should read. It comes every 4 years, and it simply is a stock-taking and synthesis exercise saying, well, where are we in terms of our knowledge, in terms of science and technology? And again, how do we develop it to promote linkages? How are we developing it to create sustainable development, etc.? And what's interesting is this is actually presented to the General Assembly, which is to the leaders actually of nations. So it's this very serious conversation about the orientation of science and whether it's actually promoting sustainable development or not, and how it's funded, etc., etc. So it looks like just a kind of a simple report or something like a human development report, but it's not actually. It's a science policy interface report. And then, of course, countries themselves have voluntary national reviews like Ireland. And in a way, this project is to help Ireland be a good citizen here. That when we go in, which we will, and we did it in 2018, we have to do it in 2022, that we go in with a voluntary national review. So we have at the moment a stakeholder plan, implementation plan. We do have stakeholder forums, and we do have a plan to actually report again on where we are with the SDGs in Ireland by 2022. But again, we'll be arguing, let's use, there is a thing called GeoHive and the Central Statistic Officer developing kind of indicators for that for the SDGs, but we're kind of arguing, please stick within the remit of the UN Statistical Commission, because if you want to be comparable across nations and you want to actually be in these reports at the UN level, produce indicators for global reporting. There's no problem producing micro indicators or indicators for work in Ireland or policies in Ireland, but we do need to be able to be comparable across nations and have a conversation about where we're good or bad in that more general sense. Again, one thing we'll be pushing for the institutional structure, like we were very taken by, or I've been very taken by UN General Assembly Resolution A69-290. And so this is quite remarkable. Like this would be like the Dáil or the Senate saying that certain constituencies in society, like academics, and we have it a little bit in the Senate, in the Seanad, but in the Dáil itself and the Dáil committees, have a right to be there. Now we know we get invited experts into Dáil committees, but this is different. This is women's groups, youth groups, Indigenous people, scientists, farmers, etc. They can self-determine who represents them across all committees, and they have a right to access all the documents and respond, etc., etc. And this is what happens at the high-level political forum on the UN Economic and Social Council, which UCD has consultative status, and that means anyone in the Earth Institute potentially, not potentially, but you can, and you have the right to attend lots of meetings. So this is a great year for biodiversity, for example. You have a right to be at these meetings that are determining the next set of goals, given that the 2020 goals are all running out, etc., on, say, the OICHA agreements, etc. So it's still not perfect. There's still people calling for more influence. But step one is you have this open dialogue between all stakeholders. And then step two, this goes into a ministerial segment, so policy dialogues, and then it goes into a ministerial segment, still with the delegates. But at the end of the day, it's the ministers who sign the political declaration most years, and then leaders every 4 years on the HLPF sign a ministerial declaration. So it's not that the leaders are ministers, like at the end of the day, the countries have the power, but they open up their deliberations and their debate in a very transparent way, and and youth groups and academics and others are invited to participate, and they take it serious. So obviously, one of the questions we're asking in this project was, could we migrate some of these HLPF structures, international policy framework, into our multi-stakeholder engagement, and so in a sense, get these major groups into country level sort of discussions so that we have a very interoperable sort of structure at home and abroad, not just on the indicators, but also on the sort of process of dialogue and policy determination. So this is the key aspects of global reporting. As I said, there's the UN Statistical Commission, and we want to create the indicators for Ireland that go directly into that. And every nation has a common, this is like, having GDP per capita. What economists are very good is having comparable economic data across nations. So we have to be very good at having comparable social and environmental and governance indicators across nations to have the same sort of impact. And this is what we're pushing. The other thing that we think is that's important is that we do also in institutional, like we do have an SDG implementation plan that has to be redone. We do have a first VNR, or preparing a second VNR. We do have the, a stakeholder forum that still has to be filled in. We still have CSO data and the GeoHive. So doing SDG sort of indicators. But it's still early days. And I guess this project hopes to kind of shape that a bit. And the only message we're giving is like, why not be interoperable with the UN HLPF, or interoperable with, say, best in class perform like Finland and other countries, like just to take lessons and not to kind of do it ad hocly or do it our own way, etc. So I'll just very quickly go through this. So benchmarking SDG. So one of the things that we just want to highlight is that the SDG is a project about integration of policy, integration of how you think about sustainable development overall. And we're just trying to stop people in a top-down sense, putting boxes and things into silos. And we would argue that even those unintentionally who kind of portray the SDGs as, say, the wedding cake, for example, which separates the environmental, the biosphere from the economic and society, that you are unintentionally highlighting the different segments of the goals rather than really zoning in on the interactions. Because where we have to win the day here is policy that is very cleverly promoting in every policy, environmental, societal, or economic policy. Let's create positive linkages across these spheres, not negative linkages, right? Which seems to be more the case in history. And to do that, what we're arguing is take the targets and cluster them up into the environmental level and look and model these linkages and be aware of these linkages. So we're very much going to work with clusters of targets, environmental targets, and we're going to model them, which they were in the negotiations, as kind of outcomes or objectives, what we call means of implementation, and then linkage goals. And people haven't really done that, even though the targets, even the open working group, are the negotiations of the goals themselves, clearly had the mandate to have this sort of taxonomy in the targets. And so they were looking for linkages across social, economic, and governance and economic and environment. They were looking at MOIs, meaning have you got the data, the finance, the technology, the institutions, the reporting, etc. So let me just go very quickly. So we don't really aggregate up by the goal. And I know SDSN did this in their index, and we think this is actually not great to do, because what we want to do is to take anything, any target documented by the UN agency, like the environmental program that they take care of, which is 83 targets, and they're actually across all the 17 goals. And that's the way we want to think about it. And we'll break them then into clusters of means of implementation, those that we consider linkage sort of goals, and those that we think are more kind of standard environmental goals. UN again, and it can work, but they said 17 goals is too much. Let's reduce it to 6 transformations. And they're good transformations. We'll recognize the energy one, the energy transformation, management of the global commons. So they've broken into 6 transformations and what's called 4 levers or means of implementation. And again, the Global Sustainable Development Report is written with that sort of taxonomy. Again, we're kind of going, that's a bit top down, because you actually have originally a framework which was based on targets and linkages, which you could aggregate over, and you lose that sort of bottom up way if you start to push these sort of top down sort of classifications. And we're not the first ones to come up with this. I mean, this was David LeBlanc from the UNDESA, when the SDGs were coming into being, talked about towards integration and using linkages, right? And of course, people in nature have talked about linkages, and we've modeled linkages as well. So to do this, there's a live document where we're trying to cross nations with various statistical meetings annually or twice a year. They're trying to get indicators per target, link it to a particular agency that will look after that sort of data and a partner agency. And then tier 1 data means, look, it's well defined, it's classified, we have it across most countries, etc. And this is a moving document. And what we want to do is fill this in for Ireland. We just want to make sure Ireland on the 83 targets and indicators populates this data set and is part of that global reporting. And again, talking about, these are all the targets of the SDG agenda. Like, so when you see something like growth and employment at like 8.2, etc., this is obviously the economic goal, or inclusive and economic growth, and you see the targets within that. What he did here, LeBlanc, was a simple sort of text analysis and saying, well, when did one target reference another target, in a sense? So it's the scientists obviously would say, well, we can come up with more linkages, and that's what that Nature article did. So it's not really reflecting true science. And then obviously the economists, the statisticians say, and which we do a bit, is that, well, we can actually model all these linkages and see which ones are statistically linked or not. And there's different association rules, statistical methods to do that, right? But the bottom idea, the bottom line that we're taking from this is that we work with the targets, and then we aggregate over them in the way we want to describe it. We don't start with a top-down goal agenda or transformation agenda. So there are 83 environmental indicators that the UN Statistical Commission have signed off on and assigned to an agency in the UNDP. And overall, the project is 232 indicators, and 83 of these are supposed to be environmental. So how do we define outcomes? Outcome variables are like these, right? So things like, unfortunately, the outcomes are desirable, sometimes defined in terms of a positive statement, like the proportion of fish stocks within biological sustainable levels. This is 14.4.4, so it's goal 14, target 4, 0.1. And then sometimes it has undesirable outcomes like indexed of you see it there, of floating plastic debris density, etc. So we have to be careful with that, and that we have to transform everything into an outcome, a desirable outcome. So what we can see is that MOIs, like, have good institutions, have good data, have good technologies. They tend to be positive statements. Linkages can be sometimes positive, sometimes negative, right? And then outcomes tend to be more positive. So what we do in terms of creating an index or an environmental index for each indicator, we take Ireland's indicator and then the identical indicator for the worst in class country, we have as a min, and then we have a best in class country, and this for a positive outcome is in that formula there. For a negative outcome, which is 1 minus that, right? Because you know, you don't want to be the best in class in plastic debris in your ocean. So obviously that's you're the worst in class, so you have to spin that around. The means of implementation, people might know this, but 62 of the 169 targets are MOIs, meaning they're based on finance, technology, capacity building, data monitoring, etc. So to give you an example, in the targets themselves, they switch from numbers like 12.1 to 12, say 0.8, then they suddenly switch to 12 A, B's, and C's, right? So this is the sustainable consumption production, and you can see, you know, the MOIs because they're alphabetical in the actual reports or in the SDG outcome document itself, and you can see their MOIs. You mean research and development, kind of the institutional planning, etc. The other one is linkages. Now, linkages, economic is spelled wrong there, obviously, as an economist, I can see that. So again, what we watch out for in the linkages is that the open working group, when they sat down to come up with the goals and targets, were saying, well, what is the main outcome of, say, the agency or the legal framework or the legal treaty? But then kind of the lead indicator that we've been using for years, like the WHO would do child mortality rates or whatever, then they'd ask, okay, you have to write down linkages across the other goals. And then finally, you have to write down the key MOIs. And that's the structure of the targets in the negotiations. And that's what we do here as well, is that we look in sort of the text, etc. We look where there's actually a linkage between natural resources and an economic sort of indicator. And we do that right across the agenda. So in a sense, our clusters then is that you have like what looks like a very environmental goal, but then we can see it intersects with society, or it intersects with government, or intersects with business, meaning economics. And it's complex, so you can have two-way interactions, three-way, four-way interactions, but this is what our environmental cluster is. And this is how, now I'm not going to go into statistical modeling, so just to keep it simple, there's different ways to aggregate over these indicators to get an index. So some people like an environmental index, but we kind of use things like a straight arithmetic average is one thing, or a geometric average. And the geometric punishes you when you do poorly on one indicator. So if you 0 on one indicator, then you 0 overall. So this kind of rewards you when you do well overall in the distribution of your outcomes for the indicators. And the harmonic one really punishes you for poor performance. So in terms of benchmarking Ireland to worse than best in class in Europe and the world, this is kind of the overall outcomes. And what we're basically seeing is that Ireland overall is 64%. Like if you take our 83 indicators, that were 64% in terms of being to the frontier of best practice in Europe, which is not maybe what we want in terms of the overall targets, but just where we are in terms of good performer, or the best performers in Europe. In terms of outcomes, we're only 56. In terms of MOIs, we're only 35. And in terms of the linkages, that's where we do well. So this is a kind of an issue we saw across the linkages, is that my simple way of thinking about it is that a lot of the indicators can be about land cover, set aside, like where keep humans off land, keeping humans off coastal areas, etc. And in Ireland, we're very bad at that. Like really 69% of our land is now the herd, or is farming. But like within farming, we could be considered best in class in terms of our environmental regulations, but at the same time, we're worst in class in terms of land cover, right? Set aside for forestry or set aside for biodiversity and other things, right? So we can be very poor in outcomes, but very good at linkages. And that's not inconsistent. The other things that we're poor at is that we really don't have the data or the technologies or the institutions or the plans. Like we're not serious. And that's not a good sign for Ireland to move forward, that we don't really have in place a good means of implementation, right? So this is our traffic light system. And it just says like, so we're orange, like we're not red, but we can do better, but linkages are green, but the means of implementation are very close to, if it was under 0.33, it would be red. So here, we don't want to work with the over. So our recommendation, I'm getting close to that, what our recommendation will be is that you take each indicator, and we have a table where we show say in Europe, we'd look at the worst and the best in class in terms of renewable energy shares. Now, obviously, very different countries, very different landmass, all that sort of idea, but still you can have a conversation about Ireland and where it could be and what are the right and wrong things to do. So we do that across all the 83 indicators, where we're able to at least have something pointing us to where, in a relative sense, we're doing poorly and where we could be doing better. And we have little kind of case study boxes that get into more details of the nuances of countries or whether this is sensible, etc. Now, finally, we talk about science policy. So the best practice in terms of institutions for sustainable development is Finland, in that they've set up nice kind of code of government committees and have representative stakeholders. They've nice stakeholder forums, they've nice innovation forums, etc. And that's the minister, I think she's the minister for, let's say, sustainable development in Finland. One thing that I find really interesting is, for the digital revolution, is Audrey Tang is a digital minister in Taiwan, and you can have a look at that link, where they show how they run the whole sort of sustainable development approach from a very digital way, and involving 24/7 real-time responses of social, environmental issues that are brought into ministries, that are dealt with policies, etc. And they show how they use frontier technology actually to do that. So rather than kind of physical meetings that happen every 6 months, they have this kind of as a rolling sort of dialogue and monitoring and reporting. And it's very interesting how all that is done and how it's policed and how they justify all these things, okay? Now, Ireland does have it's not that we don't have committees and stakeholders in them, like, you know, national councils for sustainable development, we have stakeholder forums, consultations. We do have a whole of government committee now for sustainable development, which tends to have principal operative 5 level. We have like kind of councils, citizens' assemblies. You know, there's no doubt parliamentary committees that have brought in stakeholders. Shannon, like the youth were brought into the Parliament, for example, and registered. We've, like IIEA has SDG debates, with consultancy, political advisors, we've everything. But what we're trying to say is that this is all a bit, for a small country, we should somehow come up with one kind of institutional platform, like in Finland, that would actually, working with the bureaucratic structure of government, incorporating stakeholders, that would feed well into the parliamentary committees of our DAL, which would then feed well into our overall Shannon deliberations, and that we would actually have representative democracy, but informed by science and informed by all kind of stakeholders, and not open to lobby abuse and things like this, okay? And in a sense, we've had that for COVID for a while, but we want to do much more of this for bigger challenges like biodiversity and climate. But we want to be good at this and then feed into European and EU level or UN level to really have impact. And committees like this have been working and have done well. But I guess I just want to show you, and I'll end with these slides, okay? So, like, what are we really worried about here in academia? Well, this is from the Global Sustainable Development Report in 2015. Like, you know, when we were in the hall with leaders of countries, they would always start off with this thing: look, you scientists are slow. Like, you publish your findings in reports that's hard to read, hard to understand the policy implications. It seems to take you 5 to 10 years to get anything across. Like, that's not our world. Our world is we have to respond to things. We have to synthesize things. We have to get things done. And then we kind of go, well, we don't see it that way. We see that we have known science on things like asbestos and climate change, et cetera, for, you know, hundreds of years. And we've been trying to get across science into policy. And this is the map here: when we knew the science, when we saw national policy, regional policy action, global policy action, when we actually started monitoring harm. And we say, well, no, you're slow. I mean, the problem here is that you're just not listening to science, and you're not willing to implement science, particularly to safeguard the environment and people and society in a way that you should be. And so there is a problem with science policy interfaces, let's say, right? And of course, the way to solve them is that it's not good enough for kind of academics just to leave their papers and academic papers at the doorstep of the DAL. You know, I just turn up and say, look, solutions in these papers. You've got to have a pathway and an institutionally agreed pathway, and everyone has to be rewarded to do this. And of course, this is what we're thinking of, is that, let's say we have I'm putting this up because when you're applying now for Framework 9 or for Horizon, I think it's called 2020 or whatever, or Horizon Europe, you have to show dissemination. You've got to work on stakeholder approaches. You've got to say impact on policy, impact on government. And this is what I kind of recommend, is that you do with your policy briefs, have a digital repository, open science, and your blogs, etc., and you make sure they feed into the right committees and discussions, and even send people to them through STOA in the European Parliament, for example, or to the HLPF or the subcommittees of the HLPF in the UN, in Geneva, Paris, New York. So you kind of go, we're actually going to talk to policy people, and we're going to push our things, and we're going to synthesize our work, but we do it more formally, etc. And of course, peer-reviewed articles are everything, the most important thing. And in fact, the whole system is learning the power of peer review, even in the HLPF with the voluntary national reviews. So the point is here, maybe academics, we should take more seriously the idea of, even in our publications, to have policy briefs that we cite and say they have an impact and trace the impact on policy decisions, etc. So we can just say, look, we produce papers, But then we can actually track through all the sort of technologies in these the library resort archives, where they can actually say who's downloading your article from the IP addresses, where it's being used. So you don't have to do anything, but you say, that's my impact on policy. That's my impact on what's happening. But you have to purposely set up a digital infrastructure and human infrastructure and institutional infrastructure to allow this flow and synthesis and policy to get into the policy discussions, right? And the problem here is that the lobby groups are there, right? The private interests they know when to be at the gate, and they know when when the decision is being made. But we have to be there with our work and our recommendations as well. And we have to incentivize academics to be there. Okay, I've gone on too long. I can see Karen, so I'm going to stop now. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but hopefully I got across some interesting points for debate.
No, Paul, please finish up. I just put my screen back on again, but I wasn't. It wasn't a red flag. I think it's really interesting. So please do your wrap up.
So that's it. So basically, going forward, what does this mean? Well, we'll go to at the moment, the department that Eamon Ryan is running is the one responsible for hosting the whole of government committee for implementing the SDG implementation plan. And of course, they have to, that climate action case, they have to have a climate mitigation plan, etc. now as well. And they do run the stakeholder forums, which we should be involved in, which invites obviously academia, but also civil society and other interest groups, NGOs, etc. And they are building very interesting committees, working groups, which actually mix the civil servants with the stakeholders, including academics. And the idea then is that those reports go directly into government and they're debated in the Parliament, where we should be there as well at that stage. And hopefully we'll see legislative change that's consistent with our Climate Act, for example, and in that scenario, but also all our ambitions around biodiversity and our ambitions around land use in Ireland in general, right? But what I'm just trying to say is that it's all very fine doing what we've made a research agenda out of is just saying, well, how do we get science into policy? How do we get the great recommendations and discussions across all the blogs and all the scientific papers? But we have to purposely design those institutions and design the modalities of how work is brought from our papers into these discussions and into policy and into legislative change. And of course, I think the SDGs is the other thing it's demanding of us, not only of that, but it's kind of a warning sign that like we can create useful information on one aspect of oceans or biodiversity or whatever, but we do have to have a sense of how that fits in with bigger pictures, like society, economy, governance. We just have to have a little sense of that. And there's no better way to have a sense of that than to kind of go, okay, there's something I want to change, and to actually take it like from farm to fork, if you like, that I have this good idea and I want it implemented, and to actually try and figure out or know the pathways or the institutions that you have to work through. And it's not fair on one academic to do that, because then they waste, instead of writing papers, they're just wasting their time as one person. But what we're trying to do here is to create a national framework for this, so that all academics with good ideas, they can very easily have their work farmed and represented and synthesized, and it would find itself into the appropriate committees, etc. You don't need to be, mean here, you don't need to be like the IFA or something with billions of pounds to actually start that, to make sure that you're protecting your interest group, right? So we have to protect our science and promote our science in a similar way. But I think the idea is to reform the institutions to make sure we can have whole of science, whole of society input led by science, informed by science, I should say, and obviously led by government, so that we come up with suites of policies that are integrated across these dimensions of economy, society, environment, that actually are appropriate. And we don't end up always saying, we've done brilliantly on one dimension, but Ireland should be better on housing and poverty and land. Like that's not acceptable when we see countries similar size to us doing so much better. So that's what this project is about, is just trying to focus in on, like, we want to be interoperable with European policy, obviously, but with EU, I think UN is, why are we focusing on the UN? Because this type of multilateralism is very, very important for dealing with climate and biodiversity. This is a global fix. It's not a national one or a regional one. It's a global fix. So we should be promoting best-in-class practices for reporting into the UN. And if every country did that, particularly around the EU, we'd have much better conversations at the UN, and we come up with much better policies, which are nearly implemented at national levels simultaneously to the discussions at global levels. So hopefully I got across the idea.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. That was a very comprehensive overview of what looks like a fascinating project. And I think you've given all of us areas to follow up on in the many diverse aspects of the Earth Institute. I know we've had a long talk, but I'm sure there's time for one or two questions. So just to open the floor, if people would like to speak, and just maybe identify who you are if you have a question. Well, maybe if you're thinking of questions, I might just start. I have a few actually, but some from the very general. And oh, sorry, there's one question there. Who's that? Katrina.
Sorry, yeah, that's me. Someone sent me a question just by
okay.
Airy.
Let's go into yours.
She said she had to go, unfortunately, but she said she was just wondering, could I ask the question, and then it would be recorded. So it's just. She'd like to ask a question on the governance impact of relying on data and indicators and indexes as a primary lever of SDG policy innovation. So for instance, she said, if you look at the Stats Commission data on Goal 17, it's very minimal in terms of how it captures possibilities for financing the SDG gaps. You know, it doesn't capture the full picture. And she's interested in the governance implications of that data.
Yeah, so I mean, this is at the core. So if you were, like, let's say your heart and soul is in just good policy in Ireland, and every country's different. I mean, geographically, every other way, climate, every country's different. But so one of the sort of, like, on one hand, what we're just saying is, look, yes, if we actually get into these committees and we are coming up with the policies, that then the primary, the secondary data, the qualitative, the quantitative data, common sense, all stakeholder knowledge, you know, all of this is important, right? And of course, these these indicators, they look too broad. They're too high level. They don't give you anything, right? But what I kind of get from them, though, and I know it's probably too high level for a lot of people, let's call it a quick and sloppy way of, you know, because all nations have signed up to a tier 1 sort of classification, which has been signed off, and we can compare where we are, like, let's say in forest cover or in terms of land use, you know, right across all nations of the world, right? And we can see we're very poor. And at least it puts a red light and says, you know, why are you so poor at that? You know, and then we can go into all the other data, all the other regional and all the other micro data and all this sort of thing, right? So what we're kind of hoping is that on the 83 indicators, which are environmental, that, you know, we are very poor in some and we're not too bad in others, but it's just to give us a very simple sort of traffic light or warning system that there's something different about Ireland, and asking the questions why. So the indicators themselves, don't have a huge amount of confidence, like, what are they actually measuring? You know, like, some scientists would come along and go, you know, water quality or something. But it's not important. What we should do is get sort of ambient standards here, like scientific ambient science. And that's the water quality you're aiming for. Like, forget about what other countries are doing with water quality. That's not what's important, right? And then you'd redo your index and you do it in terms of kind of scientific targets rather than benchmarking them to, say, the best in class in other countries. But we're in a policy agenda, you know, and we want to say, well, how is it that you know, in terms of water access, etc. Like some countries are just so much better than others. And then we can look at their policies, and we can look at, get into these nitty-gritties about, well, what is the true quality of the water or not, etc. So, so the project is just saying, look, the SDG agenda, for us to be truly involved in, and particularly on the biodiversity, because let's face it, the UN and these type of entities are the only ones really taking a global picture on the global commons. And this is where the conversation has to happen across China, Europe, and the US and other countries, right? I mean, and they're choosing to have the conversation on these targets and indicators, and we can only be involved in that conversation if we produce those indicators for that. But it's very high level. It's only kind of giving you directions or worries about what you're doing. But even those high level sort of ways of thinking already show that Ireland has a problem. 69% of its land cover for the herd is creating lots of social, like you even see it now when we all during lockdown wanted to go to some green spaces. Where are the green spaces for the people of Ireland, the 4.5 million people? There's none, basically, right? And this is not good enough, right? So the point is that already at that high, in that more high level, you get some insights into where maybe Ireland has to go in terms of maybe of a land commission again or something, to really understand how we could move to having kind of, you know, infrastructure that is use renewable energies, land use that is respectful to biodiversity and our plans for water, sanitation and cleaning and use, etc. So this is so absolutely right that for policy making, no, these indicators are like, they might just get you into the room or give a warning sign of a particular issue, but then when you're in the room, obviously you got to bring in all the science and all the conversations and all the knowledge of local areas, histories, etc., right? So, so all we're doing is kind of, because what we kind of see what's happening with GeoHive, for example, or with the CSO, is that they take the data that's there, which is fine, or they create data that they think is interesting to Ireland, which is fine. But what they're not doing is saying there's a problem with our global reporting, or that we're not collecting the data the UN want on global reporting, or what maybe EU nations are collecting. And I think that's a mistake, because the comparative stuff is important, and even in comparative policy is important. But absolutely, somebody just looking at these indicators who is a scientist or somebody who prefers to be more nuanced and more detailed or more qualitative, you know, you can easily come at this and go, oh, that tells you nothing, you know, and that's true. But it tells you something, you know, that's, yeah.
Yeah, yes, indeed. No, I think there's a lot of, I think it's quite inspiring for the Earth Institute to have this information, because I think it, you know, it sort of certainly sparks up ideas about things. I'm just going to see if there's one last quick question. Anybody want to speak or put in the type line, in the chat line? Okay, I don't see anything there. So on behalf of the Earth Institute, thank you very much, Paul, for that. It really was quite inspirational, a lot of food for thought there. And can I also thank Katrina and Will for setting it up and for the tech support with that. And I think it's looking out for Taz's next newsletter on the next time we meet in this forum, which I think is in 2 weeks' time, is it? There's another one lined up anyway, I know, a little later on. There
should be one next week. We'll confirm it by email, but yeah, there's
great. Okay.
Final one, Maria Bagramian, yeah.
Yeah. Well, listen, good luck to everybody in the remaining few weeks before we face back into the maelstrom of teaching.